Do you remember COVID? Uh, don't answer too fast. Do you really remember COVID? You see, it's been almost 7 years since we first heard about this strange flu like virus that was spreading around China, and over 6 years since the first cases were reported in the United States. A lot has happened in that time to inform our knowledge of COVID. This added knowledge, both valid and misinformed, shapes our memories of what it was like during those opening months of the pandemic. So, do you really remember COVID? Let's go back in time. In those first few months, as the virus was spreading throughout the United States, we didn't know what we know now. We were in a state of uncertainty, and our leadership certainly wasn't the most reassuring, claiming that the virus would just disappear like magic. Well, it didn't. Before we knew it, health officials were advising mask mandates and stay at home orders. Schools and businesses not considered essential were closed. Social distancing policies were put in place. Looking back with what we know now, there's reasonable debate on all these policies. But at the time, that's all we had. Though outbreaks are relatively rare in advanced countries today, it's important to remember that this is not the norm. Historically, human beings have always had to contend with disease. As we've become more cosmopolitan, the consequences of disease have become more severe. The strategies we've learned to use when facing disease outbreaks? Masking and isolation. Policies advocated by health officials at the beginning of the pandemic were not out of the ordinary. Stay at home, avoid contact with others, use some kind of barrier to keep from catching or transmitting what could be an airborne virus. High density gatherings such as church gatherings or schools were especially targeted for restriction. But the masks were uncomfortable and disconcerting, and social distancing and isolation is destructive to human psychological and emotional well being. As the pandemic dragged on, we all became increasingly impatient with the restrictions placed on us. Health officials, on the other hand, continued to be cautious even in the face of resentment and resistance in continued restrictions. But let's be clear, it's the health officials' job to be cautious. I mean, if you're going to entrust anyone with dealing with a deadly and debilitating pandemic, it's going to be the folks who are cautious. Think about it. It's not going to be devil may care Dave, whose response to every emergency is, whatever, you do you, brah. We want, or at least we should want, our health officials to be cautious with our health. Now, we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work and the consequences of the policies that were put into place. We know these things because we've subjected them to scientific review. While wearing specialized masks like N95 respirators did provide some protection against transmission, mask mandates in and of themselves were not particularly effective at staving off the virus. We learned that social distancing and stay-at-home orders slowed transmission rates, but were difficult to sustain. We learned that the harms of long-term school closures to learning and to the emotional health of our children may have outweighed the benefits of isolation from the virus. This is important information and stuff we should definitely take into consideration when the next pandemic hits. Though it's also important to understand that the nuances of a new pandemic may be very different from what we experienced with COVID. Still, we should take into consideration what we've learned in a reasoned and rational manner that respects human dignity. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening. Instead of a sober analysis of what went well and what didn't regarding the pandemic, the political right wing has decided upon the standard right wing response of character assault and discursive subterfuge of an important pillar of democratic society, science. And there's a reason for that. I know it's been a while since my last In the News video, but if you go back, you'll find that the last long-form video I did was on what I called the Four Pillars War. You'll also find that there was no follow-up video as promised. I kind of hit a creative wall on this one. But then I watched Anthony Fauci dragged before a hostile GOP-led kangaroo congressional committee again, subject to baseless assaults against his character, again, promoting reason-defying conspiracy theories to deflect from the ineptitude embodied in the saggy Caesar's leadership during the pandemic. Again, ineptitude he continues to demonstrate. Again. Look, why can't the MAGA movement learn from their mistakes during the pandemic and just move on? Well, I touched on this during the Four Pillars War video, and I guess I'll have to do that part 2 video at some point to add more context. Just as a reminder, the Four Pillars War is a model that I've proposed to understand the right-wing strategy to discredit liberal democracy. The goal is to attack the legitimacy of 4 institutions key to the success of any liberal democratic society, namely a professional state bureaucracy, the professional media, science and academia, and public education. The pandemic was pivotal in demonstrating the value of all 4 of these pillars, so it's no accident that authoritarian assaults against each increased in the wake of COVID. In this case, we have the assault against scientific institutions. The reality is that when the shit hit the fan and we were facing a crisis, we turned to science. Not the church, not the White House, not the military. We didn't turn to the established authorities. We didn't turn to those who guarantee stability because, well, hydroxychloroquine, bleach, UV lights. Oh, God. And for the most part, science came through. Those of us that followed the advice of the scientists and the health officials who were using the established science had a better chance of staying healthy and surviving than those who didn't. Hey, let's not candy coat this. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without mistakes. Science, real science, never is. Scientific advancement isn't a linear progression, and neither was our experience with the pandemic. As is the case with any crisis, we're all just doing the best we can. This isn't evidence of a conspiracy on the part of the scientists like Anthony Fauci to cover up some deep, dark, secret lab experiments in Wuhan or whatever. It's just how science works. Look, science isn't going to give you an immediate answer. The scientist works from a theory, formulates a hypothesis, collects the data, tests the hypothesis. It often has nothing to show for it. Sometimes the hypothesis is disproven, sometimes it's confirmed, but each test becomes just a little brick of knowledge that is incorporated into the larger body of what we know about a particular phenomenon, like a global pandemic. And while the rest of us wait, the best we can do is what the available information suggests we should do. In this case, masks, social distancing, testing. Then we learn that some masks are better than others, but they're only going to have limited impact. Then we learn that social distancing has to be more extreme than we're comfortable with in order to be effective. Then we find that there are gaps in our testing systems. Then we find that people without symptoms can still transmit the virus. Then we find. Contrary to right-wing propaganda, these inconsistencies are not evidence of incompetence, let alone conspiracy and cover-up and malicious intent. They're just people being wrong in the face of the unknown. It's the normal process of using reason to figure our way out of a bad situation. It's how science works. We need to remember that despite the fact that progress is non-linear, it was still progress. Furthermore, it was much more effective than praying or ideological purity or listening to some guy on YouTube validating your resentments. Within a year, we had effective vaccines, the single best tool for fighting the virus and ending the pandemic. That was amazing. A grand slam home run for science that saved countless lives and allowed us to return to some semblance of normalcy. This should have been celebrated. Instead, the right wing immediately set to attacking the legitimacy of this important scientific victory, shedding doubt on the effectiveness and safety and process of developing the technology. Instead of celebrating the speed by which effective vaccines were developed, the right used that speed to spread doubt. This was done even at the expense of their own authority. It was under the saggy Caesar and a government-private sector partnership that happened under his administration that this amazing technology was developed. Yet it was more important to discredit this important pillar of liberal society than it was to sustain the reputation of a failing political leader. To be clear, the speed with which the vaccines were developed was not the result of lowering the standards of science or not adequately testing for safety. Scientists were able to develop the vaccine this quickly because vaccines have been the subject of scientific inquiry for over 250 years. The first advocate for vaccines was Benjamin Franklin. Since Franklin's time, we laid a lot of scientific bricks in that edifice that allowed the relevant scientists to expedite the process. Again, there's no conspiracy, no cover-up. This is how science works. From the perspective of those who would prefer a more authoritarian society, however, the pillar of science cannot be allowed to stand. Since the birth of modern science in the wake of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, science has always been anathema to established power because science and scientists generate knowledge that is not subject to the validation of any particular authority. They generate dangerous knowledge. This is the outcome of the experiment, period. In fact, scientists may generate knowledge that contradicts established authority. We saw this in real time during some of the saggy Caesar's more calamitous press conferences. There was nothing the saggy Caesar and his mouth-frothing minions hated more than this geeky science nerd, bureaucrat Anthony Fauci contradicting their naked emperor, and for that, he must pay. Anthony Fauci has become the whipping boy for the entirety of the scientific enterprise. He has become the face of this important pillar for Republicans. Taking down Fauci is instrumental in discrediting science as a social institution and liberalism as an organizing principle. So they will never leave him alone, and they will never stop attacking science. They've been doing it for 500 years. They're not going to stop now. The consequences of this with regard to the pandemic is literally life and death. Unvaccinated people are as much as 17 times more likely to die from COVID than those vaccinated. Last year, more than 20,000 people died from COVID, with the unvaccinated being a leading contributor. Look, we should definitely examine our response to the pandemic, what worked, what didn't. We should subject Fauci and other leading scientists to rational scrutiny. Mistakes were made. If we don't want to make those mistakes again, let's figure it out. But let's do it in a way that preserves the human dignity of those who took the lead in facing a dire moment in our history, because we're going to face dire moments again, and we need competent people making choices through reason and logic rather than fear and self-preservation. Let's scrutinize in a reasoned, rational, and measured way. Trying to score political points with the paranoid is a surefire avenue to failure when the next pandemic comes. The truth is that as the pandemic progressed, the United States fell behind the rest of the world in our response, despite the fact that the US developed the most effective vaccines. Some of that had to do with our leadership. Some of it had to do with our fragmented emergency response system. A big part of it was our shitty healthcare system and the overall poor health of our citizens. If the GOP, which currently controls every chamber of the federal government, really wanted to improve our response to the next pandemic, the first place they would look is at the government agencies they are defunding and the healthcare system they are gutting. If the GOP were really searching for the truth, they would engage with Fauci in non-threatening ways. You don't put someone in a position where they feel their only defense is to take the fifth because you have openly announced your intention to put them in prison. When the lawyers are speaking rather than the scientists, that's a bad sign. Don't expect much progress. But the MAGA-maligned GOP is not looking for the truth. They are at war with science as an institution. This isn't an investigation. It's an inquisition.